First is Jordania, with his paper. He will talk about history of ethnomusicology.
Now, welcome to everyone, and I must say, hello, student. Yes. Welcome to everyone, and I must say that welcome to the world to country of ethnomusicology. What I mean, I live in Australia, and I've been into European and American countries, and I know that big part of the population, they don't usually know what ethnomusicologists do. So they have very little idea what is ethnomusicology. But in Georgia, ethnomusicology is quite a well-known discipline because of our traditional music. It's one of the main elements of our national and cultural identity. And because of that, people usually are well aware of what ethnomusicologists do. So, my topic of my paper is shaping ethnomusicology from 19th to 21st centuries. And I guess as I'm not having a PowerPoint presentation, I'm representing like more of how papers were delivered in 19th century. Okay, now the paper will address several key factors and moments that shaped the history in our scholarly field. But I'm not going to discuss the well-known factors that you already are aware, particularly from Brunet's book. And I want to pay attention to some less important, not less important, less known factors that have probably played quite an important role in shaping our field. Let me start first from one question. If you ask a Georgian ethnomusicologist or somebody who knows Georgian traditional music, what was the golden age of Georgian traditional music, they would most likely say that the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century was the golden age of Georgian ethnomusicology, because the most famous singers and most famous carriers of traditions were living at that time of the period. Okay, you can understand that. Then if you meet Georgian ethnomusicologists and ask them that what was the golden age of Russian ethnomusicological practice, not from the point of ethnomusicology, but from the point of the performers, they will also say that the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century was the golden age. Then if you meet Bulgarian and Hungarian ethnomusicology and ask them, it's the same. So again, the beginning of the 20th century is a kind of the golden age of performance practice around the world. I was in China, and that's where I said I don't live in China. That's where I sent this bill from, because and I asked them, I went there to the shop of CD shop, and I asked them, the owner, who was the most legendary performer of the Chinese traditional music. And he told me there was a certain man who played the female roles, and he was again from the beginning of the 20th century. So how is it possible that suddenly all around the world there was such an explosion of talent at the beginning of the 20th century? And it's not only in traditional music, by the way. If you look at the professional music, in Georgia, for instance, the most legendary singer is Vanu Sarajishvili. We are in the conservatorium named after Vanu Sarajishvili. So he is the most legendary singer in Georgian musical culture, in professional musical culture. In Russia, you probably know that Shalyabin is probably the biggest name, or Sobinov. Again, in the beginning of the 19th century, so what was happening in the beginning of the 20th century? I believe that what was happening is that there was time when the recording technology started. There was time when, for the first time, before that, if you wanted to hear a performer, a classical or traditional performer, you had to travel to the place where they were performing and listen to them. And if you wanted to share your excitement with others, you need to advise them, somebody, your friends, to go and to travel to listen to them again. But after the recording technology started, suddenly we had the first international stars, first national stars. There was the time when suddenly the performers could become legendary. So it seems to me that this factor, when we are discussing the beginning of ethnomusicology, somewhere in the 1980s, 84, 85, the first works or the introduction of the system of the sense, we're often forgetting that it was actually recording technology that was crucially important for the beginning of ethnomusicology. And of course then, when the archive started in 1899 and in 1900 in Vienna and in Berlin, there was a big impetus for further development of our field. Now, the next big event that played a crucial role in shaping our field was, of course, the First World War. You know, the world wars are possibly the most terrible and most terrifying events in the world's history. We had so far 2 world wars, and hopefully there was only 2 of them that will stay in our history. But at the same time, world wars are also the times of the big, not only big tragedies, but also big developments. Lots of new things happen during the World War, or for the preparation for the war, or for the military capability of the armies. You know that such things as computers, or GPS, or many other things, even microwaves, happened mostly because of preparation for the wars. And during the World War, we had unique masses, big masses of people moving to different places, bringing cultures closer to each other. Probably at the beginning with the intent of with bad intents, but finally bringing closer different cultures together. So it was not accidental that after the World War it was Germany and France, probably 2 biggest rivals in Europe, that started European Union. And of course it was because of the First World War that such a horrible disease as the so-called Spanish flu spread in the world, because in 1918 Spanish flu spread. By the way, it's also because of the war that we know by mistake the name of this flu, because it was not really a Spanish flu. It was mostly, it started in the United States, in Arkansas, but because the United States was involved in the First World War, and France was involved, and other European countries were involved, they had censorship for the bad news, so they never declared that they had this outbreak. Spain was not involved, and they declared, so we know today as Spanish flu. Now, the First World War brought a unique possibility for comparative ethnomusicology, for comparative musicology, not ethnomusicology, of course, yet. Exactly because of the war, because we know that lots of recordings were made during the First World War. And I must tell you that the biggest theories about Georgian music and connection Georgian music with the European music, and of course it was connected to the origins of polyphony, as we know, Schneider and Nadel, or Nadel and Schneider proposing these ideas. They were mostly based on the recordings of the Georgian war prisoners. So the war made possible this accumulation of this big material. But at the same time, of course, we know today we are criticizing these first comparative musicologists because of their lack of the deep understanding of the cultures. So for instance, I can tell you that both Nadel and Schneider, who wrote their papers and even book about Georgian music and about connections to Georgian and European music, they've never been to Georgia. They never recorded anything by themselves. They were mostly using the recordings that were available from the war prisoners. And also they got some materials from published materials, but they never bothered themselves to come to Georgia. And then, of course, came the Second World War. And the Second World War brought some good points and some bad points as well. The good point was that after the Second World War, such rampant comparative musicology that was practiced before was based on a couple of examples from each culture, comparing each other to each other and making a evolutionary, the scales from the primitives to the developed European cultures. They was abandoned. It was wonderful, and of course, racism that was rampant during the Second World War and brought to tragic consequences was abandoned. At the same time, we became too afraid of sometimes speaking some sensitive issues. I remember when I, for instance, had a paper in Mainz, in Germany in '91, and I spoke about the connections, possible connections and coincidence between the development, between the areas of the traditional polyphony and some genetic data and anthropologic types. I was looked at the horrible, survival of the Second World War Nazi. And I always say to my students, that we are scholars. We always try to push boundaries beyond what is accepted and what is known today. And we should remember that facts themselves cannot be racist. So, fact, for instance, if we say that some people have different colors of the skin, that's not racism. The racism starts when we say that this color is better and this color is worse. So, we should be able to make it clear that when we may become racist and when we are not racist, we just try to find out the facts. And of course, because of that, after the Second World War, comparative method virtually disappeared. And although Brunettel writes that comparative method made its comeback probably from the 90s, and as he says, ethnomusicologists are using it but not declaring that they are using it. So it's still our fear of that, no, I'm not comparative, yeah, I'd like to compare these cultures, but I'm not comparative. But it's seen very bad light. Probably it's time to abandon this also. And of course, the very important another big historical event, there was a dissolution of Soviet Union and the breakout of the so-called socialist camp, which was the Second World. You know that when we are using now the third world, term third world, it's actually not correct, because third world was there were two worlds. The first world, the Western capitalist world. The second world was the socialist world, and third world was the countries that were not connected to either of them. So today we are using third world with understanding that it's a very economically low level system, which is not what initially it meant. But anyway, after the dissolution of Soviet Union, there was the opening for the productive dialogue, and I know again from Brunettel's book that in 1988, even before the Soviet Union broke up, it was a very productive perestroika era. There was a big conference in Yurmala where there were scholars from many Soviet republics, including Georgia, and several Western ethnomusicologists, including Brunettel, who was himself there, were together for a few days discussing different views on the subject. And despite this early meeting, I must say that it's still a huge gap between Western and Eastern musicologists, and particularly Eastern, I mean from the republics of the former Soviet Union. I can tell you that in the first publication, in the first edition of Brunettel's book, there are no Russian or Soviet or any from former Soviet Union ethnomusicologists mentioned there. In the second edition, in 2005, there are 2 names only mentioned, and in the 2015 edition, there are 4 names mentioned, but still no mention of such key figures of Soviet scholarship as Asafiev or Zemsovsky or Kashovsky, quick as mentioned. And so there is still plenty of gaps to fill in our dialogue. And I would say that the Iron Curtain that was so tight between East and West has disappeared, But now we have financial curtain and we have linguistic curtain. During the polyphonic conferences, we usually don't have enough chairs here to host everyone who wants to be at the conference. But that we are not translating our sessions into Georgian. For many of our colleagues, it's a closed world, so it's difficult for them to come to the conference. Georgia has always been a country with two languages, but for us it was Georgian and Russian, of course. English is my third language, so first is Georgian, second Russian, and third is English. But not many of my colleagues and not many of my ethnomusicology colleagues speak English. We were happy that we are eight of our scholars that are able to deliver speeches in English, but still some of the most talented and some of the most, potentially important scholars struggle with this. So, but of course, the financial side of the curtain is also very important for them to be able to go to different places and attend the conferences. I advise you to be aware of that, and if there are scholars from the eastern part of the Europe and from former Soviet Union, to help them to bring these scholars to West. Okay, I'm finishing now my talk, and what I want to say today, ethnomusicology is important. It's quite difficult to discuss what is ethnomusicology, what it does, because that first it was believed that ethnomusicology or musicology, or our field, comparative musicology, was to compare cultures and make the universal scale of the cultural developments. But then we came to the conclusion that no, that's totally wrong. We need to study each culture, each musical culture, for the sake of understanding of what role music plays in this culture. So there was then the discussion, music in the culture or music as a culture. But at the same time, we are gradually coming to understand that ethnomusicology is a very wide field. It's basically how music is meant, or what music does in human society, and even not only even in human society, what's connection between human and animal music, and what basically music is. So it's a great number of big questions that are asking us by themselves, but sometimes we are closing our minds to answer them, or even to understand that such questions exist. So today, ethnomusicologists are sometimes in cognitive ethnomusicology, who study how the brain structures process the music, and what are the rhythmic patterns, or what are the scale elements that can be revealed with this study. Or sometimes ethnomusicologists go into the evolutionary musicology and try to work out what was the role of music in human society and human evolution. So today, ethnomusicology is a huge number of different topics brought together. If you look only at the Journal of Ethnomusicology, it's a relatively narrow understanding of ethnomusicology. This is still more of a in tradition of the 1950s, 1960s ethnomusicology, which rejects comparative method, mostly rejects, because there are still sometimes some breakthrough articles. And of course, we should be aware. I always tell my students that, you are expected to be better than we are, your teachers are. And you should, when you will become teachers, you should also remember that your students should try to be more clever and more understanding and think wider than you are. So we should not think that our century, 21st century, is the pinnacle of human civilization, human scholar development. We should look at our discipline from the point of our future developments. And basically, we all study music in human societies, from it doesn't matter, it's New York City musical life, or to somewhere in villages, remote villages of Central Africa. And we should be more open to various approaches of our multidisciplinary field. I think this is the message for young scholars who start their activities in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your interesting paper. And now questions, please. Please.
Thank you very much for your very important paper. And I would like I am from Russia, the only one from Russia, from Siberia, from Novosibirsk Conservatory. And when the first time I came to ESEM seminar in 2004, I already at that time, if I remember correctly, I told about this huge gap between Western and Eastern ethnomusicology, and it's very pity that because we have very important theories and names and so on, and so I thought it's very important to join, to discuss, to change ideas, etc. But still, we don't have in Russia even the main works of Western musicology translated into Russian. And practically nobody in Russia knows any important works. Probably the same in Georgia, other post-Soviet. And so still this problem exists because we also have something to share.
Absolutely.
So I don't know how to decide this problem, but it is very, very important.
Absolutely, you're right. We are now taking our first steps. For instance, we are translating from Netflix new edition of the Southern Ethnomusicology in Georgian. Yes, and I would suggest Russian colleagues to do the same. Of course, there are plenty of works, Hood or Miriam, or you can name. There are quite a few works that can give a Russian colleague understanding. And I believe that those of our colleagues that wish to work in close proximity with Western colleagues, they need to also get to know English language. But it's not only of the part of the colleagues that want to be closer to Western understanding. It's the general understanding of most of the ethnomusicologists in the country. But I would say that the same way as the works of Netl or Mantel Hood or Miriam are important for the Soviet Union or for the Russian ethnomusicology, the same way there is a big importance, for instance, the works of Asafiev. We all know those who are from Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. We probably all hated Soviet Union with its enforcing a lot of things, but we should not confuse it with the scholars. There were brilliant scholars who were also, sometimes under big pressure and big stress living in this country. So they were making some wonderful theories that can help very much also understanding lots of things in Western ethnomusicology. So this is probably one of the good places to call about this. So we need to know each other. One of the ways is to translate these works into. So I would suggest in Russia also, if you haven't thought of translating the third edition of the Brunel's book. It's just one book, and as Bruno told me himself, I contacted him and I said that I'm going to criticize you because, you met with these Soviet ethnomusicologists in 1988, and still in 2015 you are not mentioning them. And he told me, yes, that's absolutely right, that's correct, you can criticize me, he told me. But still, he told me that this book is not a comprehensive cover of ethnomusicology, just his own view, but it's still probably the best book to know general idea how ethnomusicology was developing, and it is still developing. So I would like to suggest to both sides to open more their publications and their ears to each other's arguments. Thank you.
Thank you. And the owner.
Thank you very much. I'm Ulrich Morgenstern from Vienna. I found quite interesting your idea of the golden age, the late 19th, early 20th century. Of course, the golden age of performance, it is hard to discuss. We all dream to live one day in the 18th century with a video camera, but we can't. But as for the golden age of scholarship, I think there are different reasons why we really can speak about such a golden age. It is the post-romantic period in folk music research, the incredible intellectual potential of scholars with the international, with the interdisciplinary, truly anthropological orientation, and of course then the World War and the totalitarian systems set an end for many decades. But it was really a very promising history we always should be aware of. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. I paid attention locally also in professionally, you know, Caruso, yeah? So it's like the most legendary. I went on the website and Caruso is still named as the #1 most well-known singer. And there was another name with Caruso apparently, who was compared with Caruso, and they were big rivals, but shame for us, we don't even know his name, because he apparently did not thought about the recording being important. He thought that recording was not very good quality and could not be important. But Caruso believed in the recording technology as very important, so here we go. I remember Caruso's name, we all remember, we don't remember who was his rival. So, and absolutely, 19th century, as we know, was mostly a period when the state nations were created, and the Romantic movement, and all these movements that, well, there are different ideas. Of course, Georgians also suggest that Georgia was created with Colchida and etc. But mostly, people suggest that it was this period of the 19th century when we have the kind of states in our contemporary understanding. But what I wanted to say is that yes, I was not talking about the golden age of the scholarship. It's a different thing, of course, and it's difficult to say that the beginning of the 20th century was the golden age of scholarship, although there was a very interesting Berlin School of Comparative Musicology, which we probably need to appreciate more, to reject some of the things that they were doing badly and they were not doing, like Schneider and Nadel not coming even bothering to come to Georgia. But at the same time, we need to know that finally we are in the field that we would better probably get on with doing different approaches to our material, including comparative, which is happening, and we should not be afraid of things. So thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Some time is over. Thank you.
Thank you.